So we are going to begin this webinar today. Hello, everybody. Welcome to all the participants. So the topic of the day is sanctions and all the consequences from financial point of view. We had two keynote speakers. Unfortunately, Frédéric Adam cancelled his presentation this morning due to specific reasons, with his work. So we are going to have one keynote speaker with Philippe Hoang. And Philippe is going to take the floor now and to first explain what he does, and then he'll go on with the topic. So thank you, Philippe, for being with us today. So I give you the floor.
Thank you, Veronique. Hello, everyone. So we'll speak today about sanctions, but just one comment on who I am. So I'm Philippe Hoang. I'm an ESSEC alumnus, and I'm currently working in the restructuring team in charge of aviation at Crédit Agricole, CIB, so the corporate and investment banking arm of Crédit Agricole. The reason why we wanted to speak about sanctions is that sanctions is not something new, but given the war in Ukraine, there has been a tremendous impact of the sanctions, especially in the field of aviation. And even if you're used to handling sanctions for financiers, that was quite an experience going through the sanction exercise in the context of the war with Ukraine. So the first thing is that it all started on the 24th of February. The war was unexpected. We already had some sanctions against Russia in place that were implemented back when Crimea was invaded by Russia. But because of this war on Ukraine, new sanctions had to be adopted. And what you need to understand is that when we're talking about sanctions, we're actually speaking about something very, very complex, because you have each jurisdiction taking its own sets of sanctions, and the sanctions themselves will change. Each jurisdiction will try to adjust to update the sanctions. So we're actually talking about something that is moving every day, and that can get easily very, very complex. So if we take the example of the European Union sanctions, specifically on aviation, we had one article, so sorry, that you can see on the screen.
So not yet, Philippe, you have not shared your screen.
Oh, sorry, let me try that again. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes. Yes, that's it. That's good.
So when the war started, we received the official text, which was 140 pages. For aviation, we had one dedicated article and some schedules to the text, and that's all we had. And as you may be aware, financial institutions are very sensitive to sanctions. There was some major fines that had to be paid by financial institutions because of breach of sanctions in the past. So for the financiers and for the management, that was a critical question. And because the scope of the sanction was always evolving, depending not only on the sanctions, but also on the jurisdictions involved, eventually my bank decided to implement daily meetings, daily briefing, and monitoring of the sanctions. It was quite complex also because the structure of the financing that we are using can be complex. So here I'm just showing you the plain vanilla finance lease. So you can have different lenders involved in your transaction. So lenders located in different jurisdictions. You can have also the company, of course, the client that is seeking the financing, but you can also get involved because of the currency that is being involved in your financing. And if you have other parties, such as equity holder or junior lenders, you will add some additional layers of complexity to how the sanctions will apply to your financing. Plus, you have to deal with direct and indirect sanctions. So it's really a multiple layer of analysis that you need to conduct almost every day, so to say. So more specifically on aviation, it was prohibited to sell, supply, transfer, or export directly or indirectly goods and technology suited for use in aviation to any natural or legal person, entity, or body in Russia or for use in Russia. Just in the language, you feel that the sanctions were designed to be very broad, but this language is always subject to interpretation. And the problem we had is that in the first days, we had no one to tell us exactly how we should interpret that language. Uh, you will have the same applying for the US sanctions, for the UK, because UK is no longer part of the EU. So the UK has its own sets of sanctions. If you have Japanese equity involved, you will be affected by the Japanese sanctions, etc., etc., etc. So when we're talking about sanctions, you're actually reviewing sanctions for easily 4, 5, 6, 7 countries. And because those sanctions are involving, you have to update this analysis regularly. Hopefully, we were helped by our lawyers. The major legal firms started to issue each day an update on all the sanctions, where we were standing, so that it made things easier for us. Regarding the sanctions from the EU, what we can see is that even if the sanctions were enacted, there was a provision that clearly stated that they were expecting the sanctions to enter into force at the end of March. So the key question was, what can we do before the end of March? We only have 1 month ahead of us. Effectively, what can we do to try to avoid being hit by the sanctions? And that's where the biggest work starts, because you need first to check your documentation to understand exactly what clause could be used to terminate the financing that you have, because you know that after the end of March, it will be illegal to keep a transaction through a Russian entity or involving a Russian entity. So you start reviewing your documentation and see what are the typical clauses that you can use. The most obvious one would be to trigger the illegality clause. Under financing, you always have the right to terminate a transaction if it becomes illegal for you to continue the transaction. But the debate was about, can you claim that it is illegal if in reality the illegality only starts at the end of March? Can you act in anticipation of a future illegality? So we had to look for other clauses just to find a legal ground to terminate the relationship and to terminate the transaction. The other element that could be used was checking compliance of the aircraft with the documentation. When you're financing an aircraft, you're requesting that the aircraft has a valid certificate of airworthiness, is properly registered. And what started to happen is that some of the jurisdictions started to withdraw the certificate of airworthiness or the registration for the aircraft that were operated in Russia. And they did that on the basis that, first of all, you had the sanctions, but you also had the closure of the European airspace. And based on the lack of a valid certificate of airworthiness, you could start arguing that the transaction had to terminate. The other possibility that was seen as actually more powerful was to trigger an insurance default. when you're financing an asset, you're requiring an insurance to be put in place that will cover for the aircraft, including for the war risk. And you also require that this insurance is always placed with good reinsurers or with insurer on the international market. And from the first legal analysis that we had, we could actually rely on paragraph 2 of the sanctions, which was the prohibition to provide insurance and reinsurance to entities in Russia or for goods in use in Russia. So in practice, what it meant is that we could turn to the client and say, because of that sanction, and because at that time our legal advisor were taking the view that the illegality for insurance would kick in immediately, not at the end of March, but immediately. They said that we could already tell our Russian counterparts, you're not in a position to comply with the insurance provisions because you have no longer access to the Western insurers. And even if you're using local insurers, they don't have access to international reinsurance. On top of that, you also had the behavior of the insurers, because even if you have some insurance coverage in place, the insurers, they can always revise their coverage, especially in the context of the war and allied perils coverage. The reason behind that is that obviously insurers do not want people to operate aircraft in a region that is affected by war. So what usually happens is that insurers will have the ability to send either a cancellation notice, so they will just withdraw the war and allied perils coverage, or what they can do as well is send a notice whereby they will redefine the geographical limits and possibly impose a surcharge on their coverage. So those notices are usually subject to a 7-day notice. And needless to say that insurers were very quick in reacting. When you have a war occurring, the insurers will almost immediately notify you that you have 7 days to remove the aircraft from the region that is affected by war, and that you won't have any coverage after that. So insurance turned out to be the best way to call a default under our transaction, because of the inability for the Russian entities or for the people that were financing an aircraft used in Russia to continue to have access to insurance. I don't know if there's any question at this stage from the audience. So let me. No. So let me then continue, and we can have the question at the end of the session. We had other ways of taking control over the transaction. In few transactions, you have what is called a MAC or MAE, so a material adverse change clause, which basically says that if there is any major change to the environment, then you can terminate the transaction. But in reality, clients tend to resist and not to accept this clause. So you only have that in a very limited number of transactions. So MAC was actually not very practical in the case of the sanctions. We mentioned illegality, insurance, airworthiness, and lastly, we had the closure of the airspace. The main concern here was that because Russian entities were aware that sanctions would be soon implemented, the fear was that some aircraft could be flown to Russia and would stay in Russia, which would effectively be a seizure of the aircraft by the lessee, by the client. So when we had the notification that the airspace would be closed, European airspace being close to Russian aircraft, we actually decided just to start tracking all the flights of the aircraft to understand exactly where they were located, and depending on the jurisdiction, decide whether or not we would contact the airport authorities and just ask the airport authority to prevent the aircraft from deporting. And in that case, airports do not want to take any risk. If you provide sufficient evidence that you have the control over the aircraft, you are financing the aircraft and you have the control over the aircraft, and that this aircraft is effectively being operated by a Russian operator or for Russia, the airport will not take the risk. They will effectively accept to implement this ban from departure. But then the next thing for you to arrange is to make sure that after that you're in a position to take possession of the aircraft, because the aircraft was prevented from departing a certain airport. But if it stays on that airport, you will have to pay for parking fees. And you also have to make sure that this aircraft will not stay there for months. You have to find a home for this aircraft. You have to find alternative insurance coverage for this aircraft. So you're actually moving towards a kind of repossession case that you have to implement within a few days. There were some cases where we were in a better position and where we actually had the good surprise to have some people willing to pay for the aircraft. And we actually had some clients that could raise some last minute financing so that they could fully pay the aircraft and just request the transfer of title to the aircraft before the end of March. So what actually happened is that we could have clients that were triggered an early termination of the transaction so that they could get the title to the aircraft. So the arrow in red on the chart. In other transactions, we were indirectly affected by the sanctions. The operator wasn't a Russian entity. It was just one entity standing behind the lessor, but still, because of the broad language that is used in the sanctions, we took the view that it was safer for us not to accept to carry on with the transaction. And what you can actually do is turn to the authority and apply for a license. Application for a license means that you have to send a file with all the supporting documents explaining why you believe that in your case, the sanctions should not apply. You have to do that for each of the jurisdiction that has issued sanctions that could apply to your financing. So we had to do multiple applications for licenses. In some occurrences, authorities are quite responsive. In other cases, you realize that the application does not allow you to fully, well, it's more the way the application has to be filed. It's very difficult just to answer the questions that you have in the application form, because the application is not meant to be used by financier. It's more applications that are used for the general international trade. And here we are trying to explain all the cash flows that you have in a financing transaction. So it means that you have a lot of back and forth. You have to always to call back the authorities to make sure that they're still considering your case. And hopefully, eventually, you get the license and you get the clearance to have the cash flows, even if they were originally affected by the sanctions. Any question at this stage?
Questions? No? Fine. Okay.
So I would like now to speak about all the aircraft that are still in Russia, because obviously you have some aircraft that were in Russia and that couldn't be flown to any other jurisdiction. And effectively, at the end of March, all the financings became illegal, so had to be terminated. So what will happen to all those aircraft that are now in Russia and that were financed by Western companies? Well, that's where again you have to check the insurance. As I said, you have the coverage for war and allied perils. It's called AVN 52E. It's actually a buyback of the exclusion because normal aircraft insurance exclude the war risk and the allied perils. But even if you have in the first place this exclusion, you have the possibility to buy back this exclusion through the AVN 52E. So what does AVN 52E mean? It says it's covering war, but also allied perils. And one of them is also about confiscation of the aircraft. Confiscation of the aircraft is actually subject to sublimits. So all the question is how much you're being covered, especially if you have several aircraft involved in Russia. Was your coverage sufficient to cover all those aircraft? That's the first question. The second question is also, did the insurer send any notice of cancellation? The notice that you have to send with the 7-day notice. So it was also a question of how fast the insurers were reacting to the war and how fast you were actually triggering the insurance. If you do that before the insurer has sent the notice of cancellation or before the 7 days have elapsed, you may have a chance. But if you do that after, it's probably too late. And insurers have estimated that the value of all the aircraft that are now in Russia is around 10 billion USD. Just to give you an example, for the 11th of September 2001, the losses for the insurers was around 1 billion, 1.5 billion. So we're talking about something much larger. And now insurers are reviewing how much they're willing to propose the war and allied perils coverage. Some of them are excluding additional countries because now scrutiny is on China because people are now getting afraid that you may have a conflict between China and Taiwan as well. So we started with just some sanctions, and you see that it's actually having huge impact on insurance and indirectly on all your financing. Is there any question or comment from the audience?
Yeah, I have a question here.
Yes,
Hello?
go ahead, please.
Yeah. For these affected transactions, is that included? Is leasing transaction included? For example, aircraft leased by an Russian entity or leased to a Russian entity. Is this leasing relationship being affected by the sanction?
Yes, it was, because if you had a lease in place, the sanctions were very clear that you had to terminate the lease transaction before the end of March, before even the 28th of March. So the biggest problem was that when you terminate a lease, either the client pays you the termination sums and the client gets access to the aircraft. It's a kind of early prepayment of the transaction, and the client can have the transfer of title to the aircraft. But that transfer of title to the aircraft has to occur before the 28th of March in any case, because after that, it's illegal to do that. If the client is not in a position to pay you, because termination sums can be huge, you can try to have a rejection of the aircraft. So basically, you're asking the client to early return the aircraft so that you decrease the liabilities or the sums that are due by the client because of the early termination of the transaction. But in the context of the war, because even the Russian clients were not expecting the war to happen, and because they were still operating the aircraft, they weren't really in a good position just to decide to return the aircraft earlier than expected. In addition to that, because of the sanctions that were implemented by the EU and the US, even the Russian government asked the Russian companies not to cooperate with the European and Western financiers. And we could see in some occurrences how the tone changed in just a few days, just because you also had the political pressure from the authorities. Because we saw that some clients were very much willing to find a consensual way to overcome the problems, and within a few days they were prevented by their own authority from cooperating with us. Does it answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
No
And you
problem.
just
Thank you.
said that you just said that some clients, like, they managed to pay the aircraft. What type of client they are? Like they are you know, less kind of lesser or lessee. Like, is there, yeah, who is, you know, gonna pay the aircraft? Yeah.
You know, the transactions are covered by bank secrecy, so I cannot tell more
Oh,
about the details of the
okay.
transaction, but it
Mm,
was just to show you that when you have a strong relationship, when something of this
mm,
kind happen, you may have the surprise that some of your clients, before they get the instructions from their own authorities, they will
mm,
work on finding a way of just making sure that they will continue to have the aircraft. And at that case, because they acted very quickly,
mm,
and because they were able to raise the financing to pay for all the termination sums, we were actually in a position to arrange for this early termination of the transaction and have the title to the aircraft transferred to them. So they made the acquisition of the aircraft in a very legal way, in compliance with the transaction, and before the sanction made it illegal to transfer the title to them.
okay. Thank you very much for
No problem. Any other question or comment?
So maybe you can go on now, Philippe.
Well, that was the lot about all the content I wanted to cover. So just to summarize, what we see about sanctions is that even if sanctions are not per se a financial issue, you see how much it can affect your transaction. And it means that you have to be careful first on the quality of your relationship with your client, because when something of that can happen, you need to be able to speak to your client, see how much you can cooperate. And if you're unable to achieve anything on that front, then that's where you need to turn to your documentation. How good is your documentation? Does it provide you sufficient leeway to take action when something bad of this can happen? And it's also about how you monitor your transaction. You have the insurance clause in your transaction, and you have to make sure that when something happens like that, you know exactly where you stand in terms of insurance. So just the conclusion is really to say that finance is not just about numbers. You need also to see all the other aspects that could impact your financing and that could help you when something of this kind happens.
Philippe, I have some questions for you.
Yes, go ahead, Veronique.
Yes, because I worked a bit in aircraft. If you have sanctions on Russia, so relating to aircraft, is there a difference between the aircraft that are operated by Russian companies, airline companies, and the aircrafts that are for Russian entities, but they are, located in specific places. Maybe I don't know if it happens, but as you know, if they are in
Well, actually, for those
Ireland, Delaware.
oh, you have
Yes, yes,
another.
they are not. They are outside Russia, and I wanted to know if there was a specific status in that case which applied to the operation.
The text of the sanction is affecting all the aircraft that are being used in Russia. The text says for use in Russia. So in
Yes,
practice, it meant that even let me share that with you again.
yes.
So that's the last. Oh, sorry, that's the last part of paragraph 1 for use in Russia. So it means that you had some countries that decided not to take any sanctions against Russia. Take for example Turkey. So Turkey continued to operate flights to Russia, and on our side, all we could do is just ask, among all the aircraft that we have financed to you, can you confirm that you're not flying to Russia? The reason we could have this requirement is that, again, um, even if we were talking about a Turkish company or a Turkish lessor, that company had to have the aircraft insured. And because of the sanction, we knew that insurance could not be placed on the international market or could not be reinsured on the international market, which was a clear breach of the insurance clause that we have in our transaction. So those clients actually told us, we will make sure that none of your aircraft is flying to Russia or can be caught into the sanctions. And if we have to operate aircraft to Russia, we will find aircraft financed by other people that are not affected by the same sanctions as you. But it meant that beyond the scope, indirectly, we also had to ask the question to all of our clients that could possibly have a nexus to Russia. Yeah.
But does it mean that if imagine people have planes which have been financed through you see specifically outside Russia, and the planes are not in Russia, do they escape?
Véronique, we can't hear you. Can you repeat the question, please?
I was saying if you have Russian entities who own planes and the planes are located outside Russia and not used in Russia.
They were still affected because of the way the way the language is the way the sanctions have been drafted. They are affected.
Okay. They are affected because, for instance, it's a question of insurance, or it's more a question of financing, or
it's actually both. It's both. First, the financing was no longer available because it became illegal, and second, it meant that they could only insure the aircraft outside of the Western insurers. And when we're talking about aviation, we know that if you're only relying on a local insurer, usually they have only limited balance sheet. So it means that you may have a coverage, but you're not sure that the coverage will be adequate, will be sufficient to cover any major issue. And this is the reason why we usually require that any insurance is eventually placed on the international markets or reinsured on the international markets, just to make sure that eventually you have in the pocket an insurer of good standing or reinsurer of good standing that will have the ability to pay for any loss, any damage.
Okay, so it means that even if you, for instance, if you you also exclude, for instance, the Russian Export Credit Agency and so on for in that situation.
Well, in the sanction text, you have some exceptions. You have exceptions for humanitarian reason, etc., etc. So I cannot go into all the exceptions, and you will have to check if the Russian Credit Export Agency is affected or not, or if some of the financing are are excluded from the sanctions. So it's always a case-by-case analysis, and that was really what was done each day, reviewing the updates of the sanctions on the various jurisdictions to see if new transactions were affected or if your transactions were affected but differently.
And if you compare with US sanctions, because I read that you have a very strong extraterritoriality of US sanctions towards Russia, do you have those differences? Do you see differences between
Actually,
sanctions you applied or?
We did not make any comparison because our transactions are USD denominated. So
Yes.
de facto, they are subject to the US sanctions.
Okay.
Because you have this nexus to the US because you're using the US dollar, you're actually using the clearing system in the US. So your transaction will have to comply with the US sanctions in any case.
And do you see any problem of coherence between European and US sanctions, something that, you know, you find a gap or something which is difficult to cope with because they are not coherent or in line with each other?
They weren't in line because we need to see the sanctions not as something very rational. It was more a political response to the war. And in the way the sanctions were drafted, you could feel that even the people who prepared for those sanctions, they weren't completely aware of the consequences. So they just issued the sanctions because they had to show that they were responding to the war, and the clarifications only came afterwards. So of course, they weren't completely consistent. And in the way the additional sanctions were taken, you could see that some regulators were trying to keep up with other examples that they saw from other regulators. So it was a kind of race between the regulators just to adjust for the sanctions, just to try to find some consistency. After a few weeks, after some lobbying, we could get some clarification, official clarification from the EU on how the sanctions could be understood and implemented. But it's always the problem of getting the feedback in a timely manner, because you're talking about a political decision. So it will always take days, weeks before you get the clarification. And I would say it's the same with the license, because when you have sanctions that are not consistent, there is no way you can say, oh, it's not the spirit of the sanctions, I just ignore the sanction. The only thing that you can do is make the application through a license, and then that's where possibly you will have the possibility to explain your case to the regulator and get clearance for your transaction. So unfortunately, I would say you lack consistency, coordination between regulators, but there's nothing you can do. It's the law and you have to follow it.
Okay. And if you compare the different situations, so classical financing, operating lease, finance lease, did you get a higher percentage in one activity which was impacted, or it's exactly the same?
They were affected in the same manner. So I wouldn't say that there was any preferential treatment for finance lease or operating lease. No, they were equally affected.
Okay. And when you said, for instance, you had to terminate, to do an early termination of leasing contract, I guess that because basically you also have the sanctions on the banking system. So I guess some Russian banks were excluded from the transfer payment system, etc. So it means that you had to finish the transfer of payment and anything very rapidly. You know, the material payments, they go through SWIFT or whatever. So if you had sanctions on the banks as well, how did you cope?
No, actually, we didn't face this situation because for the few clients that were willing to trigger an early termination, they could make the payment early enough before there was this exclusion of the Russian entities from the international payment system. And shortly after that, because the Russian government was preventing the companies from even making the payment, and was even asking those companies to retain the aircraft without paying for them. There wasn't any question about getting paid at all, because they had they were prevented from their own government from making any payment in relation to the aircraft.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. And concerning the the planes, since well, you have Airbus, Boeing, etc. In the 10 billion USD, do you have more? Do you know if it's more US, more? I guess it depends on the planes, the aircraft Russia uses. But have you any idea of the?
We don't have the breakdown. It's just an estimate.
Yeah.
Because financing are made on a bilateral basis. You don't have public data just showing the breakdown. But insurers allegedly have claims for up to 10 billion.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay, okay. So,
But insurance do not really make any difference between Airbus or Boeing aircraft.
yes, 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 yes.
They're all
Yes.
treated the same. But in the case of Boeing, because it's US manufactured product,
Yes.
it's de facto immediately under sanction.
Yes, because if you compare US Exim Bank, for instance, with other banks, they are more focused on the national touch of Boeing's. Well, as you know, you have some differences. So I thought maybe they might be more protected than planes from other countries.
Well, for insurance, it's really an international market. So
Yes.
it's not national. You don't have well, usually insurers just treat
Yes.
Airbus and Boeing the same.
I was thinking
Because
of the, you know, the home country rule in the OECD arrangement, you know, related.
no, but insurance, they're really working
Okay.
on an international level, and they don't make any kind of discrimination just to have any preferential treatment for aircraft that are manufactured in their own country.
And do you have new sanctions since, well, we had some events yesterday? You think you are going to have new sanctions?
No, because actually what we did is that most of the transaction, we could either unwind them,
Yes.
apply for licenses so that we could eventually clear them. We didn't write any new transaction. So the only case where we could be affected is if you have countries that would be affected by new sanctions, countries that decide, for example, to join Russia, and that will then be affected by sanctions.
But it also means that the Russian aircraft fleet is going to change because they will need to get planes anyway. So it's going to affect the market, basically.
The first problem that they have is they don't have access to spare parts, because the ban on aviation is also a ban on spare parts. And because they have huge fleets of Airbus and Boeing, they have a problem getting the spare parts. So they tried to call the Chinese, but the Chinese made it clear that they wouldn't be in a position to do that. Otherwise, they would be breaching the US sanctions and the sanctions from the European Union, which could be also an issue for them. So they made it clear that it wasn't possible for them to supply all the spare parts that were needed by the Russian aviation industry. So what we hear is that some aircraft have been cannibalized. So they're taking, they're grounding some aircraft, and they're taking parts from those grounded aircraft to service other aircraft. And there has been a big push from the Russian government to start again the production of Russian airplanes.
Yes,
you still had some manufacturer, but it's true that they only had a marginal part of their own market, and now they will need to service their national market.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry for asking a lot of questions. The topic is quite interesting. So, are there other questions from the audience? No? Other questions? Nobody has a specific question. So to conclude, Philippe, do you think these sanctions are efficient? Maybe that's a kind of trap question, but from your point of view, what do you think?
Well, for aviation, you will only see the impact in the coming months or years. So yeah, they're effective, but maybe it's too slow to produce results. The biggest issue that we see is that by deciding all those sanctions, you are actually putting finances and a lot of people under big pressure to comply with the sanctions. They're possibly making huge losses. And what we see, for example, is all the insurers that are now withdrawing from the aviation market because they see that you have a 10 billion bill. They weren't expecting anything of that kind to happen. So you see that insurance premiums are going up, and that it is getting increasingly difficult to have aircraft insurance. So you may say, okay, we needed a political response to the war, but when you take this kind of decision, you're not in. You need to take into consideration all the side effects, and obviously here those have been underestimated. And we will be paying a huge cost for those sanctions, for effects that will probably only start to be major in the coming years. But right now, we don't really see any big change.
You mean that, for instance, Air France, KLM, and other airline companies will be impacted in addition to the increase in the price of kerosene?
You have kerosene, you have insurance, and for some airlines, you also have the closure of the Russian airspace. So it was also a major disruption for some airlines that were using the Russian airspace to service destination in Asia. So for many destinations in Asia, aircraft have to fly over the Middle East instead of Russia. So it's longer. They will consume more kerosene. So yeah, I would say it's part of the side effect, and I'm not sure that all the politicians that take those decisions really assess those side effects.
And the airline companies will need to, if they need planes, in fact, if they don't buy them, they do finance lease, operating lease, which means the cost, the fees will be higher for them. Might be higher, more expensive.
Okay.
Okay, no question, everybody. I did I asked a lot of questions. Yes, a question?
Yeah, I have another question.
Yes, great.
Yeah. Thank you, Philippe, for your great presentation. It's very informative and interesting. And my question is that in the past, are there any other sanctions, on a similar scale, in the aviation industry or in other industries?
Not really. It's the first time we have this kind of scale.
Okay. Thank you. And is there any books or articles that you kind of recommend us to read to further our knowledge regarding this financial and economic impact of the sanctions?
It's probably too new to have any good book, but we can check if anything recent has been published in that regard.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Another question before we finish? Nobody? So we are going to conclude this presentation. Thank you very much, Philippe, for explaining everything with a lot of details about the sanctions and aircraft. I think it's a very interesting activity. So we thank you very much, and we thank all the participants for attending this webinar. And hopefully we will see you for our next webinar. Thank you very much. Have a nice day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.